Today we are going to talk about what to do when you sit down in front of unfamiliar Unix Linux workstation or server for the first time. This is actually part of the interview process I go through with every sysadmin applicant. This is a standard part of the practical, application test. I will use standard commands that will work for any Nix, as well as some distribution-specific Linux commands. We will start by trying to find out about the shell we're currently running. The best way to do it is by finding out process information for current shell. As you can see from the output, we're running bash. Hardly surprising since bash is a default shell on any Linux system. However, other Unix systems may not even have it installed at all, so let us say it is a good, if somewhat old example of that. Now let's find out if bash is a default shell for this particular user. So let's first find out user ID. So here's our user ID, group ID, and list of groups that this user is member of. Now, traditional Unix Linux systems, I would probably use a finger command to find out more about the environment of this user. However, on most recent Linux systems, finger is not installed by default. So I will try to give some alternate way of finding out the shell and the environment as like a home directory for this particular user. So first, the finger command. As you can see, the home directory and the default shell is listed here, as well as some of other information, which is mostly legacy. Nobody stores the mail anymore in the home directory, and nobody has the plan that you can read off the command line. It's all now in calendars. Now, finger actually works for the users that are stored in online directories like LDAP. But for the purposes of this video, we just assume that all the users are stored in local files such as etc password and etc group. So alternative way of finding out the user shell and user home directory as well as user ID would be to read it directly from the etc password file that is storing user information on standard Linux. As you can see, this is the username, user ID, primary group ID, and home directory, and the default shell. Let's now find out what kind of Nix system we're running. The best place to start is by using uname command. So, Linux it is. A bit more information maybe? So, Linux, hostname is test, kernel version, SNMP enabled, Debian version. This is actually architecture, so we're running 64-bit Intel architecture, and this is the Unix, basically operating system name, which is GNU Linux. Now let's see what specific version of distribution we're running. So we're running dev 1, which is basically the derivative from the Debian with the systemd stripped out. So it's running the traditional Linux init system. It's basically the Debian GNU Linux 1 based on Debian Jessie, and all of the information you can see is in a couple of files in the etc directory. Next up, networking. Networking is an integral part of the Unix system, so every sysadmin needs to be comfortable with IP networking concepts. Now, the infoconfig command is not found. On some of the systems it's been deprecated, and it's suggested we use IP address. You can see in the output the loopback interface with the IP assigned, and the Ethernet 0 interface with the IP, subnet mask, and some other information like hardware address. Now, if config command is actually available to root user on this system, somehow the regular users are restricted from using the ifconfig command. So let's try to switch to the root user. And then we can actually use ifconfig. This is pretty much the same output you're going to see on every Unix system. So ifconfig, even so it's, everybody says it's deprecated, it's still available on every Unix, and it's been available on every Unix for decades. And you can see the output is pretty much the same as IP address command. I mean, it gives you the same information, somewhat differently formatted. The IP address, the mask, and the hardware address. It will also show you some additional information like MTU. So this is running standard Ethernet MTU, not the jumbo packets, and some of the statistics of the interface since last reboot. Of course, this is just a system with one interface. On other systems you will see multiple interfaces, maybe multiple IP addresses if system is multi-homed, or you may see LACP bundles of number of the interfaces into the one virtual interface. But this is basically the output you're going to see for each interface configured on the machine. Now, next thing to find out about networking is network kernel routing tables, and you do it by using the netstat command with an R switch. So you can see that the default gateway destination is this IP address, and interface for sending packets out to default gateway is Ethernet 0. And also there is a specific route for directly attached subnet. So this is part of the directly attached subnet, and the Unix machine will communicate with them directly without sending the packets to the default gateway as any other machine would do the same, just if TCP/IP networking is configured. Next thing to see is what services this machine is running and which ports it actually listens to. Again, you do it using the netstat command, but with the different switches. Netstat-na, it's going to be long output, so pipe it to less. So, what can we see from this listing? The SSH, standard port 22, is listening on all IP addresses, with zeros denotes all IP version 4 addresses. The SMTP server is running on a local loop interface only, so it's not exposed to the outside. And some other services that you can try to find out what they're doing. You also can see that some of the services are listening on all IP interfaces, IPv4 and IPv6. So again, this is SMTP listening on localhost interface for IPv6. This is SSH listening on all interfaces on IPv6, and this seems to be the HTTP server listening on all interfaces on IPv6. So this is basically the standard commands you would run to find out what version of the Unix you're running on the machine, and to familiarize yourself a little bit with the environment on that machine. You can find out a little bit more about the hardware. If you know this is a Linux system, you can actually find out about CPUs, a lot of information about it. So the processor 0, as you can see, and processor 1. So this machine, actually this is virtual machine, it has 2 processors. DMI decode will give you a lot more information about the hardware. Basically will give you information about BIOS and all the PCI interfaces. A lot of information. Most of it you're probably never gonna use, but some of it is very helpful, especially if you're gonna be troubleshooting the problems you're having on your machine. So we'll stop here, and if in the comments I see any request for any additional tricks on the Linux command line, I will post those videos later. Now, one thing to remember is, why am I using the most generic commands? Because you cannot assume that if you sit at the command line and this is going to be Linux. There are BSD machines out there, there are Solaris machines out there, and believe it or not, there are AIX and HPUX machine out there, and if you're being punished for something you've done wrong in your previous life, you may actually sit down on SEO Linux terminal one day. So do not assume, always find out for sure, and once you know what are you running on your machine, then you can use some of the specific commands for that operating system. Systemd maybe on systemd commands on Linux, on the modern Linuxes, if the systemd is installed. Solaris commands, there's some specific commands there as well, especially when dealing with the hardware, if it's a Spark hardware. So just use the opportunity to poke around any unfamiliar Unix machine you can get your hands to.